My name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and with Horror Mayhem over for another year, I have just this last video to make before I fall down the rabbit hole of westerns in June on the Range. Now that the month's over, the moratorium must be up on Roger's Cheap Old Book Club pick from Michael K. Vaughan for the month, which was Richard Marsh's The Beetle. Although classed as a mystery, this book does more than dabble with horror, and being published in the same year as Dracula, I think helps and hinders the book. It didn't do anything to the book to begin with. In 1897, for every copy of Dracula sold, 6 copies of The Beetle were sold. The book was serialised in the weekly magazine Answers under the far more cumbersome title The Perils of Paul Lessingham, The Story of a Haunted Man. The book is split into 4 separate but overlapping narratives, all detailing the same events. And the narratives come from Robert Holt, who is a down-at-heel clerk by profession, but is unemployed, out of a situation, I think you would say at the time. And the character does show, at least in surface detail, the plight of the poor in Victorian London, and when even the poor houses are full up and can't accommodate him, in desperation he decides to turn to crime. He burgles what he thinks is an empty house, but definitely picks the wrong one. He is waylaid and brought under the control of the Beetle. The second narrative comes from Sidney Atherton. He's a chemist. He's a blowhard. He's pretty much of an idiot. But he is entertaining. He has a short fuse, a high opinion of himself, and a higher yet opinion of Marjorie, who delivers the third narrative, the daughter of one MP and the secret fiancé of Paul Lessingham, another MP. Paul Lessingham later in the book goes on to enlist the services of Augustus Champnell, I won't say occult detective, but a detective who has a familiarity with the supernatural. And it's this character that delivers the final narrative. Champnell also appears in Marsh's follow-up novel, The House of Mystery, as well as a selection of short stories by Marsh. In a number of respects, this book demonstrates the late Victorian, early Edwardian fascination with the supernatural, growing social conscience, a nascent concern with the role of women and questions of gender, and concerns about the effect of British imperialism, its impact on the world, and the world in coming back to London having its effect on the British. It has a large dose of fear of foreigners in that respect. The evil entity who is threatening Lessingham is simply known as the Arab. The book has some of the pitfalls of late Victorian or Victorian literature as well. The comic turns are hit and miss. Louisa Coleman, the landlady, Percy Woodville, another one of Marjorie Linden's suitors, a cab driver with a surprisingly large amount of backchat. There are a few examples of something which is always a turn-off for me in Victorian literature. I don't know how other people feel about it, but transliterated accents on the page I do struggle with sometimes. Firstly, to believe them, and sometimes even to understand what's being said. There are some loose ends in the book as well. Sidney Atherton is not just a chemist, he specialises, it seems, in chemical warfare. And at the beginning of the book, or near the beginning of the book, he is demonstrating to his friend Percy the efficacy of a poison gas he's created. Now, I was waiting for this poison gas to have some importance to the story again, but other than the killing of some random cat, it never seems to have any purpose. I'm not necessarily saying that's a deal breaker, but none of this detracts from the horror, which, if you don't like insects, you're really not going to like the book. The fear of the foreigner turns into a fear of the alien, as there is examples of what appears to be transmogrification. But there's also, and this is the thing that struck me most about the book, and I think might be the reason people link it with Dracula so often, the horror of mesmerism. In the Beetle, as in Dracula, the victims are entranced, mesmerised by the Beetle or the Count. Both employ some life-draining kiss. In Dracula, this is obviously the blood-sucking. In the Beetle, this is more nebulous, or drawing the life force out of victims. But the upshot for both is the same. They put someone else in their control. The Beetle and the sect, the Children of Isis, appear to have been using this method of mesmerism for some time. Paul Lessingham had been subjected to this many years ago and is still suffering what we would now call PTSD. He cannot bear to see a picture of a beetle, he cannot bear to hear the words the beetle, and the Beetle knows full well that this will be the case. Mesmerism would have been a subject well known to the Victorian reader, and in fact by 1897 the mid-19th century fad, as it had been translated into literature, was beginning to wane. But whilst it might be seen in terms of simply quackery or a literary expediency, there were still some believers. And in fact, mesmerism, as first conceived by Mesmer, is not something that is evil in and of itself. It begins as almost a medical practice. And here I think you have to draw a distinction between mesmerism and hypnotism. I'm certainly no expert, but this is YouTube, not the Sorbonne. Mesmerism, you can take control of somebody, especially how it's portrayed in literature. In hypnotism, the person being hypnotised has to be a willing participant. The problem that mesmerism suffers, and indeed hypnotism has the same issue, is that it attracts the cranks and the quacks. There are late 19th century, early 20th century courses and shows where people are brought together to enjoy the benefits of this personal magnetism, where they can harness this power in terms of being lucky in business, in terms of being lucky in romance, and I guarantee you that you could search for similar courses today and find them within minutes. Mesmerism has an impact on the American New Thought movement, on Christian Science, on American spiritualism. It's something that seems to permeate a number of different cultures, and no less with literature. And I'm going to use to link those two things the case of Professor John Elliotson. John Elliotson was a medical doctor in the early 19th century. He's one of the founders of UCL, the University College London. Medicine was in a transitional moment at that point. There were still ticket holders turning up to anatomical lessons, cutting up cadavers. Elliotson initially wanted to expose quackery and bad practice in medicine, although he was still a fan of since discredited methods of cupping, blistering, purging. But he then, falls, no pun intended, under the spell of mesmerism when a specialist from France arrives in England, and he glums onto this and really runs with it. He gives a number of demonstrations of the effects of mesmerism, the power of mesmerism, to the annoyance of some of his colleagues who uncover his practices of mesmerism as quackery and as being false. But by this point, he's become good friends with Charles Dickens, who also expresses an interest in mesmerism and fancied himself as a little bit of a mesmerist himself. Elliotson is forced to resign his position at UCL, but he comes back in 1850 to found the London Mesmeric Infirmary. So there's still a ready audience and still a cohort of believers in the practice to make it a lifestyle choice. Mesmerism is mentioned in a few Dickens novels, and in his unfinished last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, there is a character who is a malevolent mesmerist. He is, one of the villains of the piece. Other writers take this to more extremes. In 1841, Honoré de Balzac, in his book Cell Murule, has incidences of mesmerism. The Strange Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar by Edgar Allan Poe in 1845 concerns itself with practicing mesmerism even as someone's life passes away. Hawthorne relates to mesmerism in 1851 in The House of the Seven Gables. Robert Browning in 1855 even has a poem called Mesmerism. This is something that really does sort of take people's imaginations, but it's the corruption of the practice which holds fascination from a literary perspective. So why is mesmerism seen as so horrific? They were looking at it in its beginnings in the late 18th century and the early 19th century as if it was a science. We don't view it that way now, but before viewing it as a science, any practice of something, mesmerism or hypnosis, would have been seen more as sorcery or magic. So there's the initial reaction of not wanting to be involved with that side of things. From a psychological standpoint, mesmerism or being mesmerized entails the loss of control. This is what happens to the victims in the Beetle. The fact that it is an involuntary loss, the fact that simply a glance might be enough to take away your control, is a scary thought. Another scary thought is the fact that you might be doing these things while still be fully conscious of what you are doing. You see what you might be being asked to enact. You feel the emotions of what you're going through, but you are unable to do anything about it, and that is pure horror. There's horror in wondering if you're ever going to escape it. Being snapped out of the mesmeric trance feels 10 times worse, it seems from reading it, than waking a sleepwalker, for example, which is something you're not supposed to do. Even in more modern interpretations like The Manchurian Candidate or even Captain America and the Winter Soldier, there is that worry of a trigger setting you off to fall into that state again. So there's the horror of never being able to fully escape, to never regain the control after it has been ceded once. But then I thought of the other horror I've read this month, and specifically the instances of possession and exorcism that occurred in The Amber Witch and in The Exorcist. There is a dark echo there between the possessed person and the mesmerised person, and different roles of the person inducing the mesmeric state and the exorcist who's trying to remove someone from that possessed state. And it's maybe that cultural memory of possession and exorcism that makes us fear that possession that is entailed in being mesmerised, that suggestibility. So you would think in the last 7 centuries we've gone on a fair journey from witchcraft and possession through fear of foreigners and mesmerism to hypnotherapy on the NHS, falling under the spell of hypnotists. And there's that magical language again, now seems to be reserved for entertainment purposes only, parlour tricks. But you still do get the occasional horror film crop up using it as a plot device. So there might be a vestigial fear still there, and there might be life in the old dog yet. Anyway, I don't have any answers, just some thoughts and just some questions. Horror takes a back seat now until maybe October, Spooktober, or maybe use Victober to have a look at some more Victorian ghost stories. For the next couple of months, it's all cowboys and aliens. So until then, bye.